Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome. We are so excited. Can everybody hear me? We're good. Yes. Okay, perfect. So we are really glad that you're joining us to our Be the Bridge here in the South Metro, Minnesota. And I am super excited that Karen Gonzalez is here with us. And we are going to introduce her in a little bit, but I am going to get us started with prayer. So if you will join me. Lord Jesus, we are thankful for the time that we have to come together to talk about issues that we believe stir your heart and should stir ours as well. We want to be open. We want to learn. We want to grow. We want to care about the things that you care about. So we invite you to be with us today, that you will speak to us through Karen, and we are open. In Jesus' name, amen. So before we introduce her, we are going to have a time of questions and answers. If any of you have questions that you would rather be anonymous, you can send them to me directly on the chat, and I will post there, and then I will ask them, obviously without giving your name, when we have the time for that. Or if you have my number, you can also text me, but the chat will work. So I am going to turn it over to Akochi so that he can introduce our speaker.
Excellent. So before introducing Ms. Gonzalez, let's just provide a little bit of context. Immigration, as we all know, that's a topic for today, is a polarizing economic, political, and social issue in the United States and Europe and other parts of the world. But what we are concerned about here is what the Bible has to say about this issue. What about all the migrations in the Bible? And how do we hold in tension, on the one hand, the laws and the need to obey the laws of the land, and also, on the other hand, the Christian's responsibility to immigrants, which the Bible speaks a lot about also. So to help us with some of these issues, we are really honored to have theologian and author Karen Gonzalez. She is a speaker, writer, and immigrant advocate who herself immigrated from Guatemala as a child. Ms. Gonzalez is a former public school teacher and attended Fuller Theological Seminary, where she studied theology and missiology. And for the past 11 years, she has been a nonprofit professional, currently working for World Relief. And this is an organization that serves immigrants and refugees. She wrote a book about her own immigration story and also about the many immigrants found in the Bible. That book is called The God Who Sees: Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong. Ms. Gonzalez, once more, it's an honor to have you here, and we're all excited to hear what you have for us. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for having me. Thank you for that nice introduction. It's wonderful to be here with you all, and it's always an honor for me where people want to learn more about how they can love their immigrant neighbors better. And so I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to, everybody see that? Okay. Great. All right. So I want to tell you a little bit about a woman in the Bible that I really love, and that is this woman here, Ruth. There's a picture of her and her mother-in-law, Naomi, and in the distance, you can see Naomi's other daughter-in-law, Orpah. You know, people are often surprised to find that Ruth's famous words that are often heard at weddings are not words that she spoke at the beginning of something wonderful or joyful in her own life. You know, she says to her mother-in-law, Naomi, she says, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. These are words of commitment to her mother-in-law, Naomi, after they have both experienced a series of devastating losses. They have experienced death, widowhood, infertility, abject poverty, an uncertain future, and forced migration. So the context of these words is not the best of times, like a wedding. It's actually the very worst of times. Now, in the biblical text, we learn that the story of Ruth actually begins in Bethlehem with Naomi and her family. Bethlehem is a word that means house of bread. But in the story, there's no more bread in the house. There's a famine. People are hungry, and when people are hungry, they soon become economic immigrants who go off in search of food. Now, Elimelech and Naomi, this married couple, immigrate to Moab, which is a country that is a Gentile neighbor. And there in Moab, they find what they need. So things look good for a little while, but then the family's breadwinner dies. Elimelech dies, and that's really terrible. But things brighten up a little bit when the two sons get married, because Naomi and Elimelech have two sons. And for 10 years, life goes on. And then disaster strikes again, and the two sons also die. Now, even in Israel, where there were laws to protect widows and orphans and other people on the margins, these laws were not always followed. And we can assume that Moab probably didn't even have any protections for widows and orphans. So 3 widows was really triple trouble. These are 3 women in a really fragile and delicate situation. How would they survive? What would happen to them? So things brighten up just a little bit more when Naomi hears that there's bread once again in Bethlehem. The famine is over, and in fact, it's harvest time. Finally, some good news. So she decides to go home, and she decides to take her daughters-in-law with her. But it's something strange happens in the story, and we don't know quite why, but she suddenly changes her mind, and she says, no, you know what? You both should stay in Moab after all. Now, we really don't know. The text doesn't tell us why she changed her mind. But I wonder if maybe having experienced what it means to be an immigrant, she wants to spare Orpah and Ruth a similar experience in Bethlehem. Maybe since her daughters-in-law aren't pregnant with sons, they're just more mouths to feed. Or maybe she remembers that no matter how much she loves them, the Israelites despise their neighbors, the Moabites. In Deuteronomy 23:3, it says, Ammonites and Moabites can't belong to the Lord's assembly. Not even the 10th generation of such people can belong to the Lord's assembly. So we know from this verse and many others actually that the Moabites had no love at all for the Israelites and vice versa. And something interesting about the Moabites that you should know is that they are descended from Lot, who, if you remember, was Abraham's cousin in Genesis. And they descend from Lot and his incestuous union with his daughters. So for the Israelites, the Moabites were just awful, terrible, half-breed people, and they were not welcome. They were not a part of their community. So maybe that's the reason that Naomi changes her mind. Maybe that's the reason she decides, you know what, maybe you shouldn't come with me. Maybe you should return home. Whatever her reason is, she manages to convince Orpah. Orpah is sensible. And she decides, you know what, mother-in-law, my best shot at remarriage probably is in my own country, among my own people. So she decides to return home. But Ruth is undeterred. She's almost irrationally loyal and faithful to her mother-in-law, and she decides to stick with her come what may. Now, I like to imagine a lot into the stories, and I like to imagine what it must have been like the day that those two women arrived in Bethlehem. Here they are, shuffling in. Things had been terrible the day that Naomi and her husband left, but at least she'd had a husband, and at least she'd had her young sons. These were a woman's only means of protection and security in the ancient world. And now she was coming back, and she had nothing except an equally sad-looking widow walking beside her. What a sad pair they must have been that day. But the good news is that they arrive at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, this is a really good thing because there are other verses in Deuteronomy that tell us something really positive, which might explain the timing of Naomi's return. Whenever you are reaping the harvest of your field and you leave some grain in the field, don't go back and get it. Let it go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows, so that the Lord your God blesses you in all that you do. Similarly, when you beat the olives off your olive trees, don't go back over them twice. Let the leftovers go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows. Again, when you pick the grapes of your vineyard, don't pick them over twice. Let the leftovers go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows. I'm reading here from the Common English Bible, which I really like because they use the word immigrants rather than stranger, which means something really entirely different in our context. What I love about these verses in Deuteronomy is that in the story of Ruth, we find this command carried out. Two penniless widows, one an immigrant from a despised community, arrive in the society of Judah, Bethlehem. The immigrant Ruth is welcomed unto the field of Boaz, where she gleans what the harvesters have left behind, just as these verses say. Boaz knows that even someone from a despised immigrant community is entitled to a decent job with a decent living. And the work that Ruth performs is not undignified. It is not demeaning. It was hard work, but it's exactly the kind of work that everyone else did in that society. Boaz acts with great generosity. It's true, he really does. But something that's often missed about him is that he was actually not free to act in any other way, not if he was a follower of the God of Israel. So let me say that again. He was not free to act in any other way because it was God's law that guaranteed Ruth a place gleaning the crops. All of the people on the margins, not just Ruth, had the right to go to a field and begin to work for their livelihood. And Boaz had an obligation not to order his regular workers to harvest everything for his own economic gain. They could not harvest what grew in the corners of the field, nor what they missed on the first time around. Because according to God's law, compassion for the poor and for the marginalized is more important than efficiency and more important than profit. And Ruth is entitled not just to a job, but also to respect Boaz tells his workers, no name calling, no harassment, and no assault. And what does that tell us? These were things that commonly happen to people on the margins of society, just like they do today. And both Ruth and Boaz were entitled to Sabbath, entitled to time off for rest, for reflection, for celebration, and for worship. I love this story, and at first glance, it seems to be this quaint little biblical story in which all the main characters, Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, do everything right. In fact, sometimes when I've seen this story in children's Sunday school curriculum, it appears almost like a Disney princess story. You have Ruth, who is the fair maiden. You have Naomi, who's like her fairy godmother, who counsels her. And you have Boaz, who is this knight in shining armor that saves the day. But actually, that's not what's happening in the story. That's very surface. If you look at the dynamics that lie behind the story, you'll see something else. It's another dimension, and it's something I've heard theologian Carolyn James call the blessed alliance. So everyone in this story has something to offer. So you have Naomi, who is an older woman and who is not able to work, but she's a cultural insider. She is able to counsel Ruth. She's able to teach her about the culture, and she's able to help her to position herself so as to benefit from this alliance that they make with Boaz. Then you have Ruth. Ruth is poor and she's an immigrant widow, but she's a hard worker. The text tells us that she gleaned and threshed until evening, and she collected 5 gallons of threshed barley. And she's also really socially savvy and compassionate. She politely but appropriately makes herself known to Boaz, and she takes good care of her mother-in-law. She takes on an obligation that she didn't have to take on. And all of this earns her Boaz's favor. And by the way, she makes the first move in the relationship, which is perhaps a sermon for another time. What you also have is Boaz. Now, Boaz, we can all acknowledge, is the most powerful of these 3 people. He's Baal, he's an owner of land, right? He's a native citizen. And what we learn is that he understands the biblical use of power for the good of everyone. So rather than reveling in his own male privilege, rather than choosing the exploitation of human work and life or the care of his own people only, he chooses justice and compassion. And he offers Ruth an honest means to earn a living while providing a safe working environment for her. And he does this long before there's any benefit for him, long before there's any promise of marriage between them. So here in this little book of Ruth, we see a picture of this blessed alliance. We see men and women, citizens and non-citizens, co-laboring, working together side by side for the flourishing of their communities. Nobody looks out just for his or her gender or ethnic group. Nobody becomes superior and subjugates the powerless. Everyone thrives, not just survives. It's a really beautiful picture with a very happy ending. We know that Obed, the son of Ruth and Boaz, eventually becomes the grandfather of King David in the lineage of Jesus of Nazareth. And Naomi, a woman who was destitute, who was depressed at the thought of life without male protection, says of this woman, Ruth, "You are better than 7 sons." The blessed alliance is what happened when God's people submit together to God's laws and work together to serve their communities. Things work much better, and human beings become their very best selves. And this is what we need in our communities. We need Ruths, we need Naomis, we need Boazes, people who get together without fearing the other and what they might lose. And they and their community flourish together. And as part of God's plan, we know that generations later, the Messiah came to us through this union of Ruth and of Boaz. And he ushered in a new kingdom, one of peace and justice. I love this story of Ruth. I love it because throughout the Bible, you know, I've been a Christian a really long time. And when you're reading the Bible and you read that, you know, God says one thing and God's people disobey. So God sometimes brings judgment or lets natural consequences fall to them. You know, there's so many prophets that God sends to call the people back, you know, because the people have been led astray by idols or other things. But here in this story of Ruth, we see what happens when people, instead of turning to their fears, they turn to their God and they trust in the commands of God. And it brings such blessing to the entire community. I love opening with this story because I think it's an important story for us to remember as we talk about what the reality is for immigrants in our country. So I want to start by talking to you a little bit about migration, just in general. There were these statues that were in on the coast of Marseille in France, where there's a lot of North African immigrants. And it made me think of this quote by the Somali poet Warsenshire, who says, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." See, just like Ruth, most immigrants have not dreamed of leaving their countries. And in fact, when we leave our countries, we leave pieces of ourselves behind because we leave homes, we leave comforts, we leave our heart language. Often we leave extended or immediate family, and we leave our sense of self. We have to start all over again in a new country like children. It's a deeply painful and traumatic experience. So immigrants don't embark on that journey lightly. They either do it for economic reasons like Ruth, or out of a need to protect their lives and those of the people they love. They also do it to reunite their families. Perhaps dad came a long time ago and the family's been separated, and now they can reunite everyone. But the immigrant life is not easy, and neither is the journey to a new country. So let's talk about the major reasons that immigrants leave home. So according to leading think tanks on immigration, there are 3 reasons. One is to work, to improve their economic situation. Number 2 is to reunite their families. And number 3 is to flee persecution and violence. These are the top 3 reasons. Now, sometimes people also leave seeking opportunities and adventure, but that's a really, really small group. The majority of people migrate for these reasons because, as we talked about, the immigrant life can be quite hard and you don't embark on that journey lightly. So I want to talk a little bit about terms because I know we hear a lot of terms floating around, and I want to start with immigrant, just any person who leaves their home country and moves permanently to another country. So you may have heard terms like expatriate, right? Expatriates, though, typically go for a time to another country and then they come back to their home country. That's very different from being an immigrant. Now, refugees are people who flee their home country to another country, usually a neighboring country, and there they apply for refugee status due to persecution for one of 5 reasons. Persecution for their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Now, this membership in a particular social group, it's very, very specific. So let me give you examples of members of a group. Women and girls who could be or have been victims of female genital mutilation are a social group. Women and girls who are educated in certain countries in the Middle East and North Africa are a social group. Members of the LGBTQ community in certain countries are also in a social group. That is what a social group is made of. So refugees receive an immigrant visa before they arrive in the US. Now, I want you to know something. Only 4% of refugees are ever resettled. 4%. That means the majority either flee and live in neighboring countries, living underground, trying to survive however they can, because only 4% are ever resettled in other countries. An asylee or an asylum seeker, you hear this word a lot in relation to our southern border. So people who flee their home country due to war or violence and present themselves at a port of entry to the US and apply for asylum for the same reasons, due to persecution for their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So asylum seekers receive an immigrant visa after they arrive at the US. You can't apply for asylum unless you present yourself at a port of entry to the US or you're already in the US. This is why people come to the border to seek a petition. So they're not trying to cross illegally. What they're trying to do is apply for asylum, which is their right under our laws. Now, people may apply for asylum within 1 year of being admitted to the US, and less than 10% of asylum applications are successful. So the people that arrive at our border, they're being denied actually their right to apply. And that's what people are protesting, because people need to be given their right to apply, even if that application is later denied. So in brief, this is the difference. Asylee after or at a US port of entry, refugee, they get their visa beforehand. But it's the same reasons, fleeing for the same reasons. So what happens to immigrants once they're in the US, whether they're documented or not? So there was a study done by the Immigration Policy Center, and it revealed that immigrants are more likely to become victims of unreported crimes, wage theft, assault, muggings, domestic violence and sexual assault, human trafficking, and they're more likely to experience workforce inequities, exploitation at work, and a breakdown in family structures. Now remember that one of the top 3 reasons people migrate is to unite families, right? But actually immigrants are more likely to experience a breakdown in family structures due to the pretty stressful conditions that they endure once they arrive here. So, there's a lot of rhetoric around immigrants and crime, but the fact is immigrants are more likely to be victims of crimes, not to commit crimes. That is the sad truth and reality. 70 to 80% of immigrant women who cross the border between the US and Mexico are sexually assaulted. In fact, it's such a crisis that there are groups at the border that they know that women, are going to cross, and so they give them birth control. They pass out different contraceptives to women, so at least they won't become pregnant from these assaults. That's how common it is, and that's how widely known it is. And this is a real crisis at the border, is this vulnerability of women and girls. Now, I think it's important for us to establish, how did we get here? How did we get to this place? Well, let's talk a little bit about immigration history. The first immigration law was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So you may remember from history that a lot of Chinese immigrants came to the US, particularly to the West, to build the railroad. Well, once that railroad was built, it was a sort of, well, thank you, but now you should leave. You should go back home. And this act came into being. By the way, this was not repealed until 1943. So it was on the books for a really, really long time, over 50 years. And it was said that Chinese people lacked sufficient brain capacity and that they were unable to assimilate. And this was given as a reason for why this act was put into place. This was like on the books, on the law. Now, around this time, what happened is a lot of Chinese people decided rather than return to China, you can imagine travel back then was not as easy as it is today. So a lot of them fled south. So there's actually along northern Mexico, there are communities of Mexicans that are of Chinese descent that migrated there because of this Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1911, we had another law, the Congressional Commission Report. And this report was particularly concerned about all those immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. So it said that criminality was inherent in the Italian race and that high rates of illiteracy were due to inherent racial tendencies. That's a direct quote from the law. And so that was followed by 1924 Immigration Act. And this was heavily influenced by a movement called eugenics that I'm sure you have heard of, but this was a junk science, widely discredited, that basically tried to say that the white race is superior to all other races, and they try to find scientific support for this, right? And so under this law, they try to have really strict quotas depending on your national origin. And there was something called an Immigration Restriction League. And it said that this new wave of migrants who were not Western and were not Protestant, lots of Jewish people, lots of Catholics, these people were biologically inferior and less capable of assimilation than the races that had populated America in previous centuries. So if you were from Northern Europe, so Scandinavia, if you were from Germany, if you were from Switzerland, all these places in Northern Europe, you had a free pass to migrate to America. It was very easy to get an immigrant visa. But if you were from other countries, Slavic countries, if you were Jewish, if you were Southern European, then it became very difficult for you to enter the country. So the next one is the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. This is the law that we still have on the books. Now I want you to notice something about that 1965 date, because it coincides, of course, with the Civil Rights Movement. So this is why I think it's really important for there to be solidarity between groups of historically disenfranchised or excluded people, because justice for one of us is good for all of us. The attention that the Civil Rights Movement brought to injustices against Black Americans also highlighted the inherent injustices in the immigration system, which was incredibly racist, as you have heard. And so they completely revamped the system. And instead of it being based on race, which all of the three previous laws had been, it was now based on family connections and employability skills. So in 1996, there was this other act. It's called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. I like to talk about this because a lot of people think that, oh, Democrats are really good for immigration and, Republicans are really bad. And it's kind of that simple for many people, but it's actually not true. Both Democratic presidents and administrations and Republican ones have done a lot of harm to immigrant communities in the United States. Probably the Republicans slightly less. But one of the most harmful laws came under Bill Clinton in 1996. And this law has kept so many people from being able to adjust their status. There are people here today in the US married to a US citizen, and they have US citizen children, and they cannot adjust their status because of this act. Because basically this law says that if you weren't legally admitted into the country, even if you're married to a US citizen, even if your children are here, you have to leave for 3 to 10 years and then apply. And so for most people, they don't want to separate their families for 3 to 10 years. And so this has become a really, really harmful law that has been responsible for dividing and separating so many families. So this is our history. It's really not pretty. It doesn't jive with what a lot of us have heard about this beautiful immigrant mythology and the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, right? There was a lot of exclusion of a lot of different people historically. So why does this matter to us? Well, immigration is an economic issue. It's a social issue. It's a political issue. But because it deals with human beings who are made in the image of God, it's also a Christian and a biblical issue. And it's one that God really speaks to. So, because immigration is an issue that is fundamentally about people who are made in the image of God, we don't say illegals, we don't say aliens, we say undocumented or unauthorized immigrants. We want to remember to keep the person and to remember that we're talking about human beings always. So immigration is a biblical issue. And we know that God has a special concern for immigrants because the word in Hebrew closest to immigrant is ger, right? It's this word, and it appears 92 times in the Old Testament. And usually it appears like this. The same law applies to the native born and to the immigrant living among you. So the scriptural witness is that we are to care for the immigrant stranger living among us without any caveat that exempts us from this responsibility if it's not in our economic interest. This is a quote from Welcoming the Stranger by Jenny Yang and Matt Sorens. And this is a truth that we as Christians have to reckon with. God is not a capitalist. And in fact, God has given us really clear instructions about how to treat widows, orphans, the poor, and the immigrant stranger that lives among us. So often when I talk about this, people ask me, well, what about Romans 13? I mean, if we're talking about, it's one thing if we're talking about refugees, right? But what if we're talking about undocumented immigrants? You know, what about this verse? Because this verse says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So I think it's important that we pay attention to scripture and not just conveniently avoid those verses that maybe make us uncomfortable when it comes to a particular issue. But I do think it's important for us to consider a few things about Romans 13. And one is that US laws are not God's immutable laws. God's laws are immutable, but our laws change all the time, right? It used to be legal to own people as slaves. It used to be legal to deny women the right to vote or to own property. It used to be illegal that you could abuse your spouse and your children, and that was your personal business. But these are things that we saw harmed human beings, harmed God's children. And so these laws were changed. They were repealed, right? When we recognized that they weren't just laws. So there is, for us, if you consider Romans was written by Paul, who spent the majority of the New Testament writing letters from prison. Because in fact, whenever the Roman Empire came up against his faith, he chose his faith and his God. And ultimately, we know that Paul was executed by the Roman Empire for his faith. So I think using a verse like this to exempt us from our responsibility, our God-given responsibility for our neighbors, I think that's misguided and it's wrong. So there are a lot of myths out there about immigrants and migration. So I want to talk about some facts, some truths. So the first fact I want to talk about is that immigrants today are not any different than the ones that came generations ago. We share the same need and we share the same humanity. So what has changed? What's changed is our laws. Federal immigration laws have changed. So now there are no lines to get into to migrate lawfully. This leads to unlawful migration because there are still a lot of jobs here. And unlawful migration leads to vulnerability and invisibility. You know, when people know that the law can't touch them because someone is undocumented, they tend to abuse and take advantage of their neighbors. So I think it's important at this point for us to talk about, well, how does a person migrate legally to the US today? By the way, at Ellis Island, it used to be that they would process 5,000 people a day sometimes, a day. I mean, we now have visas, the work visas, that they give 5,000 visas for a whole year. But they used to process sometimes 5,000 a day. And the only way that you weren't getting in is if, of course, you are from a part of the world that wasn't welcome. But if you were Northern European, you know, as long as you didn't have lice and you didn't have tuberculosis, they welcomed you in. Roll the red carpet and let you in. Where I live on the East Coast in Baltimore, it used to be one of the biggest immigrant ports, and German Lutheran pastors would hold up signs at the port that said free breakfast in German as the German immigrants were getting off. There used to be a big, big German community here. How do people migrate legally now? So there's 4 ways. The best way for you to remember is blood, sweat, tears, and luck. So blood, close relatives of permanent residents or US citizens. Close relatives. This means your parents, your children under 21, your siblings. That's it. Nobody else. Spouse, children, parents, siblings. That's it. No other relatives are allowed to come in. This is how my family came to the US. We were undocumented for a time, but we had filed for an immigrant visa. My dad's brother, my uncle, had filed it for my dad. So blood is a way that people can come. Another is sweat. So you may have heard of things like H-1B visas. There's limited numbers of these visas, and they're mostly given to people who are highly educated, and they have to be sponsored by an employer. This is incredibly expensive. It can cost $15,000, $20,000 for these kinds of visas. That's why it's only big companies that pay for them. A lot of Johns Hopkins here in Baltimore, I have a friend who works for them, and she's a pediatric neurosurgeon. So it has to be skill sets that are needed in the US, and there's a shortage of those people in that profession in the US. So very limited and only given to highly educated people. Then there's tiers. A fraction of 1% of the world's refugees who are fleeing persecution are taken in by the US, a fraction of 1%. But again, to qualify for refugee status, you must be in a country, right, where there's persecution, and now you're fleeing to a second country. It's in that country where you now apply for refugee status, and the average wait before you're resettled, if you're selected to resettle, is 14 years. So it's an awfully long time to wait. And the last one is luck. There's an online visa lottery. It's only for certain countries. So if you're Mexican, Guatemalan, Salvadoran, Indian, Chinese, or Filipino, you cannot apply for the visa lottery. It's only for certain countries that are not very represented here in the US. The odds are 1 in 300 of getting it. And if you get the visa, it's just for you. You come to the United States, by yourself and start your life here. So these are the only ways. There are no other ways. So when you hear people say, people need to get in line to migrate legally, I want you to know that for many people, there is no line. Even for my family, we waited 3 years for an immigrant visa back in the 80s. Now that same line for a brother to sponsor another sibling is 13 years. And if you're Mexican or Chinese or Indian or Korean, that line is 23 years. 23 years you'd be waiting before you would get a visa. So 55% of the refugees to the US are Christians. In fact, we take in a lot of persecuted Christians into the US. There is an understanding out there that people think that most of the people that we take in are Muslims. And I want to be clear that I believe that we should welcome and care for all refugees. All refugees are experiencing persecution, but these are the facts around it, that 55% are Christians, and that the chance of being killed in a terrorist attack committed by a refugee is 1 in 3.64 billion. Undocumented immigrants pay taxes. So people don't know this, and they're very surprised to learn this. But in fact, it's about 12 billion in taxes every single year. And the way that they do this is that the Social Security Administration, what they do is, it's very easy. I don't know if you've ever looked at your Social Security card, but any teenager with a good printer could falsify your Social Security card. I mean, it's a little piece of construction paper, basically, right? But it's your legal right to work here in the US. Very easy to falsify. And if you live in big cities like LA and New York, and you walk through certain neighborhoods, people will even ask you if you want to buy one. And so this is what people do, is they get one like that, or some people get a number from the IRS called an individual tax identification number. And the IRS knows that anyone who requests this is undocumented and doesn't have a Social Security number. So they give you this other number that you can use to pay your taxes. So as much as $12 billion per year in withholdings are given to the federal government that don't match a valid Social Security number. And this is mostly from undocumented immigrants. So, but here's the interesting thing. These same immigrants are ineligible to benefit from Social Security or Medicare, and they can't collect from any federal public benefits, food stamps, welfare, subsidized housing. They're not eligible for any of that. So they're paying into a system that doesn't benefit them in any way, other than, of course, they live here, right? So it does benefit them in that way. So most economists say that the United States gets $80,000 net gain from every undocumented immigrant that pays taxes. So why do you think we have a government who has such a conflicting response to immigration? Because one part, the IRS and the Social Security Administration, accommodate payments from undocumented immigrants, but then there's this other part, the Department of Homeland Security, that says they shouldn't be here, they shouldn't be present. It's almost like there's two signs at the border, and one of them says help wanted, and the other one says keep out. I want you to know that employers who hire undocumented immigrants aren't penalized. It's a slap on the wrist. So if we're really serious about this, why don't we have more secure documents as for a legal right to work? Why is this still this flimsy piece of construction paper? And why does the government accommodate payments if these people are not supposed to be here? Why isn't there a consistent response? And that's because we have labor needs. And the fact is, immigrants create jobs, and immigrants also fill in the holes in the labor market at the high and low end of the job scale. So in my city, I know where immigrants work. I encourage you to find out where they work in your city. In my city, immigrants do a lot of work in industrial laundries, because we have all these Johns Hopkins hospitals, right? And they wash linens from hospitals. It's where a lot of immigrants work in my city. They also do a lot of service jobs. They do a lot of Uber, Lyft driving. They do a lot of home health care work. This is what immigrants do in my city. Immigrants bring strong family values. Immigrants learn English, and immigrants integrate into our communities. Now, you may think, well, I've run across immigrants that don't speak English. And of course you have, because although immigrants are always striving to learn English, 23% of first generation immigrants speak English well, only 23%. Now, why is that? Usually because they migrated as adults and they're working and they don't have time to do work as well as take English classes. I don't know if you've ever tried to learn a language as an adult, but I lived in Russia for some years, and I can tell you, learning English, learning Russian as an adult versus having been born in Russia or even raised in Russia from a little child was extremely challenging. And I got to experience a little bit about what it must have been like for my parents when they moved to the US, because I was 30 when I was in Russia, and it was very, very difficult. And I was in a very privileged position. It was still very difficult. Only 88% of second generation immigrants speak English well. So I want you to notice this huge gap, 88%, which means that by the third generation, 94% of third and later generations speak English well. By the third generation, those immigrants have lost their first language. So if they were Italian, if they were Kenyan, if they were Central or South American, there's a good chance that by the third generation, their children no longer speak their language. That's the real crisis, is how do you keep that first language? Immigrants have an excellent work ethic, and through their work, they support our social systems. Most immigrants to the US are in their prime working ages. That is why so many immigrants during this pandemic have been essential workers, right? Immigrants come to the US to work, to improve their lives. That's one of the top 3 reasons. So immigrants are 13% of the US population, but 16% of the workforce. So they make up a greater percentage of the workforce than their actual population. And when it comes to the medical field, 50% of our biotech workers are immigrants, 40% of medical scientists, 28% of doctors and surgeons, 22% of nurses and home health aides, and 15% of nurses overall. So that's the high end of the scale. Let's look at something else that's equally important. Much of our food comes from California's Central Valley. 70 to 75% of farm workers in California are undocumented immigrants. So I want you to think, when you go to the grocery store, I want you to stand in the produce section. And I want you to remember those terrible fires in California and in other places around the country. And I want you to remember those pictures that we saw of these fires blazing in the distance and big black clouds of smoke, and these immigrants on the ground collecting produce so that the rest of us would have food to buy in the grocery store. They work among pesticides, they work under the hot sun, they work without sick days, without vacation days. These are really hard, backbreaking labor. And when you go to the produce section and you stand there, I want you to think about how much immigrant labor is represented in this space. And how much would a tomato or a banana or whatever would cost if we actually paid migrant workers what they're worth, what this work is worth. And immigrants are good neighbors. Historically, as immigration rates increase, crime decreases. Now, this is not because we are better people. All of us are just people, right? But there's good reasons for this. And by the way, this research on a link between criminality and immigrants has been done for over 100 years. They've done this research over and over again. And it began, do you remember when I told you when there was a lot of Italian immigrants migrating? So they started doing studies back then, because remember back then they thought that Italians were prone to criminality. So that's when they first did studies around this. So we know this research has been proven over and over again. But it isn't because we're better people. It's actually because, one, there's a threat of deportation. Immigrants suffer more for criminal behavior. So because of that, we're less likely to break the law because we know that the consequences will be really serious for us. There's also what they call a healthy immigrant thesis. That means that people know that migrating is going to be really difficult. So they self-select. The people that come here are the ones who want to. And of course, we also know there's been greater enforcement. So more interior enforcement is deporting unauthorized or unlawful immigrants. So in short, immigration is good for countries and for their economies. But even if it weren't, God commands us to welcome immigrants, to do justice for immigrants, and to love immigrants as we do ourselves. Now, when I tell people this, usually they want to know, well, how can I respond to this? What can I do in response? And I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly because I want us to have a chance for questions. There's this great quote by James Baldwin. He says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. It's really important for us to examine our views of immigration. And if you're a Christian, and I think all of you are here, you have to ask yourselves, are my views primarily informed by my faith? Or are they informed by my family? Are they informed by my sense of I worked hard to get here, my merit-based beliefs? Do they come from my social group? Where do my beliefs and my standing on immigration, where does that come from? Is it really informed by my faith? And I think along with that, we have to examine our relationship to immigrants. Immigrants are 13% of the population, so we're all around. Are these relationships based on mutuality? Or are you the giver of charity? Are immigrants a cause or an activist project? Do you give and do you receive hospitality? These are really important questions. Another important thing for Christians is to read the Bible in community with immigrants. We've been taught the Bible from one perspective, and that's the dominant culture. Do you know why I see the story of immigration in the book of Ruth? Because I am an immigrant. That's why I have eyes to see it. I go to an African-American church here in Baltimore, and one day I gave a sermon at my church on Mary. It was during Advent, and on Mary, the mother of Jesus. And a Black woman in my church came up to me and she said, I've always, loved Mother Mary. She said, because Mother Mary knows what it's like for her son to be killed by the state. And that's what happened to my son too. And I know Mother Mary, I know she knows my pain. There's something I'd never considered in reading the story of Mary at all. But reading the Bible in community with people who are different from me has taught me so much that I would have not seen. So I'm not telling you that you have something to learn. I'm telling you, you have everything to learn from reading the Bible in community with other people and being open to the way that they read the scriptures and the way that the Spirit works in them to bring it to life. A lot of the Bible, not all of it, but a lot of it was given to and written by people on the margins, not to the power brokers of society. And finally, you can choose to speak up and to show up for immigrants. There's this good trouble and bad trouble, right? And you can speak up to your friends and relatives. Maybe have that uncomfortable conversation at Thanksgiving. Maybe you won't change Grandpa or Uncle Joe's mind, but there are other people in the room that are listening and that need to know that we don't tolerate language that is racist or xenophobic, that it's not okay. And we don't excuse it just because somebody's older or just because somebody had a bad experience once with a person of color. So we have to speak up to our friends and relatives, but We can also speak up by calling our representatives in Congress. And this is something that you can do for immigrants who are not citizens of the US, who don't have that avenue of advocacy. There's this great quote by Martin Luther King. He says, "On the one hand, we're called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be the initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructure." So I'm going to stop there. And I want to give you a chance to share questions. And at the very end, I want to share with you what it is that people are talking about when they talk about comprehensive immigration reform, and what it is that most immigrant advocates are working toward. And just so you know, spoiler alert, it is not open borders. But I do want to share that with you because I think it's important for you to know that. So, Ellen, I don't know if you want to do the questions or.
Yes, I have some questions here. I think the first thing, more than a question, it's like a wondering, is just with what's happening at the border right now with our Haitian brothers and sisters. If you could explain maybe a little bit what is happening, you know?
Yeah, so there's something called Title 42, and I think you've heard of this, perhaps you didn't know it was called Title 42, but during the Trump administration, because, you know, President Trump was very transparent about being very anti-immigrant from the very beginning, right? And one of the things that he did during the pandemic is establish this thing called Title 42, which basically says that on a public health basis, we're denying entry to immigrants because they are bringing in COVID into the country. And so this was the reason that was used to turn away the Haitian immigrants that you saw at the border, but they were still denied their right to apply for asylum, because even if you're not admitted into the country under Title 42, which many immigrant advocates are pushing for that to be overturned, because it really is just something that is designed to harm immigrants. It really hasn't kept the country any safer in any way. Because really you can test immigrants at the border. If you really were that concerned and you cared about their welfare, you could have them tested and make sure that they didn't have COVID before they entered. But they're essentially being turned away and flown back without being given their right to apply for asylum. So again, they're not trying to swim across. What they did is they had, you know, kind of camped out because they wanted to go and apply. And what happens is you meet with an immigration official, and this immigration official does what they call a credible fear interview and asks you about your, you know, under what reason you're applying for asylum, essentially. But they're being denied all of that. They weren't given any of those rights at all. And they're just being flown back under this Title 42. But it's really a terrible injustice. And of course, you saw the pictures. They were being treated horribly. You can deny people entry and still honor their dignity and humanity and treat people well. And of course, that's not what's happening.
So along with that, there's a comment of, we have enough people in our country of our own that we're not taking good care of. So shouldn't our response as Christians be to take care of our own people before we let other people in?
Okay, so yes, I hear this quite a bit, and I think it's a good question. And here's the thing, you know, people, I get asked this question pretty frequently, and it usually people either bring up veterans or people experiencing homelessness, usually is what they say. But the thing is, we don't have to choose. We can take care of our own, and we can also welcome other people. Again, there's no caveat in caring for the immigrant stranger. There isn't a verse that says, if all your wounded veterans aren't cared for, you don't have to take in immigrants. That's not what it says. And in fact, we have an abundance of jobs. We have an abundance of resources. And to be open and frank with you, migration is really natural. It's really normal. People have always done it historically. People have migrated. I mean, I would encourage you to open the book of Genesis and to look in that book, just in the first 13 chapters, right to the point where we meet Abraham, and look at how many times people move, people migrate to different places. It's a lot more than you think. It's a lot, and it's for all kinds of different reasons. So the fact is that it's okay for us to take in immigrants, and it's good for us to also care for people experiencing homelessness, for people who are veterans and fought in our wars and are now, unwell as a result of that, and for people experiencing other issues. There really isn't, we don't have to choose. We can care for all. And that's really the greatness of our God. We serve a God who is bountiful, who owns, as the Psalm says, the cattle on 1,000 hills, and you can take care. I was in Tijuana. So I've been to two parts of the borderlands, and I was in Tijuana over the border from San Diego. And it was really fascinating to me. I went to this, it's called Casa Migrante. It's run by the Catholic Church. And they have a house. I don't know if you know this, but when you get deported, you are not allowed to go home and get a suitcase of your stuff. You're deported with whatever it is you're wearing, and that's all you have. And so in this Casa Migrante, they had clothing, of course, because what they do is when people are deported, they help them to stay in Mexico. So I don't know if you know, but Tijuana actually has a really strong economy because there's a lot of call centers there. There's a lot of factories that have gone overseas that are there. And so the economy is actually quite good. So what they do is they have clothing, they have food. They even had, medical services, job services. You're allowed to live in the shelter up to 90 days. And then they help you transition out into other housing. But they had art therapy and music therapy for people who've been deported. And I was really so blessed by how much care there is for immigrants in so many places. I think we have a tendency to believe that it's only the United States taking in migrants, only the West taking in migrants, but countries all over are taking in migrants. I was just reading an article about Chile because the economy in Spain is so bad. And of course, we know of the crisis in Venezuela. They've taken in hundreds, thousands of immigrants from Venezuela, from Spain, and from Haiti as well. And so every country has this kind of a situation. And I think somebody made a really good point there. My family left Guatemala because the United States funded a civil war there. The United States gave money to the government to take land and resources from indigenous people. The largest wave of Guatemalan migration happened because of the United States interference. And the United States overthrew our government in the 1950s. They overthrew the government in Chile, Argentina, Nicaragua, Panama. I mean, I could go on and on. There's just a lot. And now what do we have? We have a lot of Afghan refugees. My organization, right, is resettling a lot of Afghan refugees. And it's because of what? More war. I met an Afghan person when I was in London once, and he told me that his country was geographically unlucky. That's what he told me. Our country's just geographically unlucky. First, the British wanted to be there, then the Russians wanted to be there, and now the Americans. He's like, we can't be free, we can't be left alone. And I said, no, your country's not geographically unlucky. Other countries are greedy for resources. And that's the problem. It's not that you're unlucky, it's that there's a lot of greed involved. And a lot of most of the coffee and banana plantations, all those things aren't owned by Guatemalans, they're owned by the American Fruit Company. So this is something that we have to reckon with as Americans, that we create a lot of refugees, not us personally, but our government does that, you know? All the people that are upset about Afghan refugee resettlement, right? We created that. We created those refugees, right? By waging a war there for the last 20 years. Remember the last huge wave of refugees that came from Vietnam? That was another war we were involved in, right? And that brought a whole lot of refugees to our shores as well. But again, it was this problem that was created by our policies. And so that's another reality on a macro level, you know. But I think despite whether it was created by our country or not, I think the larger issue is that these are human beings. And as human beings, there are siblings, you know, and we have a shared humanity. And God says in the Bible, a responsibility. You know, the Moabites were not loved by the people of Bethlehem and Judah. And yet there was this blessing that they received from welcoming Ruth into their community, right? For doing what God's law said. And it was amazing, right? Because they could have been very stingy with their resources. They could have said, we're going to take care of our own. We don't need to be taking care of these Moabite, you know, widows, right? But they didn't do that. And there was this abundance and flourishing for everyone in the community as a result. I think there is something quite miraculous that God does in our communities when we open our hearts to God and we really walk in trust that there will be enough.
Hello, Ms. Karen Gonzalez. My name is Lord Jean. Thank you for your concise presentation. I love the quotes by James Baldwin and John Lewis. Beautiful. I do want to follow up on the question about the Haitian refugees. As I am a Haitian American, my parents immigrated here. I was a first generation, first child born in the United States. And so the question I have, and this may be a two-part question, is what do you say to the fact that you hinted on it a little bit about solidarity with other immigrants and the lack of that being shown by Haitian immigrants with even our Mexican brothers and sisters, and how can we create solidarity between those two groups of people? And also, do you believe there is some inherent racism there, because that would include the deeper racism and how Black Haitian immigrants or refugees were treated versus refugees and immigrants from Mexico crossing our borders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for asking that, because there is a reality that people don't like to talk about, but in our immigration system, you fare much better the whiter you are, and that's true. And I've seen it in action. I wouldn't have believed it, but I have seen it with my own eyes. I've seen people from Western Europe come out of prison and not get deported like the law says they're supposed to, because they're white and they can blend into the country. And I want to address your question about Haitian immigrants here in the US, perhaps not having a lot of solidarity with newer Haitian immigrants, because it's actually really common. Now, it's not a good thing, but it's a very common thing for people who have been here a while and who have kind of found their place. I call it like kind of shut the door behind me. Like I was the last good one. Shut the door behind me, right? There's no more good immigrants coming from where I came from. I think that there is something in us, right, that wants to separate ourselves from people who have that kind of poverty and vulnerability. You know, when I was a little girl, I translated a lot of things for my mom and my dad. They would ask me, you know, what does this mean? What does that mean? And I remember my mom asking me, what does it mean when somebody's dirt poor? You know, and I told her, oh, it means, you know, you have like a dirt floor, like you're that poor that you don't have. And she's like, that's what we had when I was growing up. You know, she said we were dirt poor. And there's a way in which a lot of immigrants want to distance themselves, right, from that past, from the poverty, perhaps the lack of access to education and other things. And so I've seen it in my own family, you know, the uncle that sponsored us, he's like a Trump supporter. He's married a white American woman, and he's forgotten, you know, that he was dirt poor at one time too. And he wants to, and he takes every opportunity he can to say terrible things about immigrants, you know, on his Facebook. And so I've seen that in my own family. But I think that we can, pardon the pun, we can be that bridge, you know, we can be that change for our communities. Because I think, you know, I am always arguing with my uncle and with other members of the family, and my father's always saying, just leave it alone. He's just like that. You're not going to change him. And I'm like, I know I'm not. I said, I know I'm not going to change him. But there's like my cousins and their kids listening to this. And it's really for them. I want them to know that this is not okay. I want them to know, you know, that we're the same. We share the same humanity. We don't, that distancing ourselves from our immigrant neighbors in need is really denying our own humanity, because they are us and we are them. That's what Jesus did, right? Jesus didn't say, be nice to immigrants, y'all. He said, I was an immigrant and you welcome me. He took on that identity for himself, right? Of a vulnerable, unwanted, unloved kind of person. I think we have to be that in our communities, to our families. And I spoke to a group of Asian American students at Hopkins. They told me the same thing. What do we do with our parents who don't want anything to do with even immigrants from our own country that are new? And I told them the same thing. I said, we can't, first of all, we can't just accept what our parents say and act and, you know, adopt that kind of thinking. I said, that's not a good thing. I said, and we can't also allow them to just say that in front of us. You know, we have to keep having that conversation with them. And, you know, it's actually worked with my own father. I've had a lot of success talking to him about things. Yeah, that's Stockholm syndrome, right? People want to align themselves here. Honestly, I think the root of that is white supremacy, kind of wanting to align ourselves with here and deny there. And no, you know, we're the same. So that Haitian person in need that was at the border, that was being treated so violently by the Border Patrol, 50% of whom are Latinx descent, 50% of the Border Patrol. That's how you know there's white supremacy within people's mindsets, within institutions. It's because here they are, you know, coming against one of their own, another human being in need. So it's not a really simple answer. I think it's a very hard, long road, but I think it's one that we can't give up on. When we were younger, we used to just excuse our aunts and uncles when they would say racist things. You know, there's a lot of racist white supremacist saying in Spanish because there's a lot of anti-Blackness in our own communities. And we used to just let it go and not say anything, but not anymore. You know, now we don't do that. We made a decision that, nope, whenever they say that, you know, we're going to say something about it. And they're at least going to know it's not okay to say that in our presence. You know? So I think that's what we all have to do. And I think for us to say that older people can't change, I think that's ageist, you know. I think it's older people can change and do change. And I think we have to give them that opportunity. But that means, you know, talking back, talking back to them as uncomfortable as that can be. And so I've challenged my dad and my uncles and aunts when they say things that are racist, when they say things like, oh, don't stay out of the sun, you're going to get dark. We have to be the ones to do this or nothing is going to change in our communities.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anybody else in the group has some questions. Karen, I do have one more if you have time.
Yeah.
I think it has to do with the idea of like the perfect immigrant, you know, like
Yes.
we only want the nice immigrants, and you kind of touched on that we actually have laws that kind of say that. But how do we deal with that idea, right? Like the idea of this is what an immigrant should act like or be like in order to be accepted.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we have some standards for immigrants that we don't have even for our own fellow citizens. And there's a myth of a good immigrant and what a good immigrant looks like. They're grateful, they came the legal way, you know, they do kind of service jobs, they keep their head down. We have these ideas, right, about what a good immigrant is, but ultimately, immigrants are just people. They're not better than us, and they're not worse than us. We're all just people. You know, I'm writing another book about immigration, and one of the things I'm writing about is, you know, when I used to be really ashamed because my mom died of cancer when I was a teenager, and after my mom died, my dad became an alcoholic, and I used to never tell people that. There was one person in my college ministry group where I became a Christian, where all my friends were who knew about this, because I had so much shame around it. Because what kind of immigrant is an alcoholic, right? And so I would always kind of present a facade of the way that my family was, like we're the good kind of immigrants. But here's the thing, my dad lost his wife and he didn't really know how to cope. Growing up in a culture that's very machista, didn't have a lot of healthy ways of knowing how to cope, living in a country where he doesn't speak the language fluently, having to do service jobs when he had been an engineer in our country. And he's just a person. And you know what? There's a lot of native born citizens that have addictions too. Because we're a people and we're broken and we turn to things that we shouldn't to cope with our losses and our brokenness. And I kind of realized that I was holding kind of by not talking openly about this, I was holding my dad up to this myth, right? Of this. And similarly, you know, I had a lot of struggles with depression and anxiety, and I used to feel really terrible about those things. Like I wasn't the kind of immigrant who was contributing, you know, to the good of society. But the thing is, you don't have to be an immigrant to be depressed and to have anxiety. And so I think we have to examine that. I remember telling a church group that I was talking to in this very wealthy church here in Baltimore. I was telling them, I would always tell a story about an immigrant in Baltimore. And I was telling them about a man that I knew who was an immigrant, and he liked to smoke weed, and he drove Uber by night, and he worked at the Amazon warehouse by day, you know, here in the city. And that he had married someone, he had paid her so that he could get a green card, and then he got in a divorce a year after he got the green card. And he would work and bring one of his children from his home country. He'd sponsor them one at a time because he had to save so much money to do it. So I share a combination of like good things and just not great things, you know, about this person. And even before I'd finished telling the story, they were all kind of shaking their heads and like, yeah, this is not the kind of immigrant you want to talk about if you want us to get on board with you. And I was like, why? Have none of you ever smoked weed? I said, really? I said, how many of you in this group, you know? I said, have any of you in this group ever been divorced or have broken off a relationship for less than honorable reasons? Because that happens. And it's true that there was this mixture of good things and bad things in this person, just like there is in all of our lives. And that's what I was trying to get at with them, is that why are you holding him to a standard that you can't meet when he's just a person? And I think we have to check ourselves for that. that we remember that when we do that, we're actually taking away from someone's full humanity when we're expecting them to kind of be a certain way because they're immigrants. And we're actually treating them like guests rather than treating them like human beings, like our siblings. So I want to share with you what this, you hear about comprehensive immigration policy reform. Can you see my screen there? This is what we're talking about here on the screen. So this is what most of us are encouraging our legislators to do. I'll be honest with you, this is not my dream legislation or anything, but it is feasible and practical, and it's something that both sides could agree on if they have the will to do so. So one is making it harder to immigrate or work illegally, securing the border and creating an enforceable workplace authorization system. That means having everyone do it electronically instead of letting employers choose. And that would mean making a social security card more secure than what it is now. Make it easier to enter and work lawfully. We have a lot of labor needs, and we also want to be part of keeping families together. So make it easier for people to get work visas. And then finally, require those here unlawfully to earn legal status. They can pay a penalty, pass a background check, pay taxes, or prove that they've been paying taxes. And so this is what people are talking about. And I would love to see this, but so far our legislators haven't had the will to push it through. So I think there was another question. Is there another question?
Yes. And I don't know if she wants to ask the question herself.
Sure, I can. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. This is Nneka. I am one of Akochi's classmates from Nigeria. It's so good to be here, and it's so good to hear the articulation of all this, the immigration and how it relates to the Bible and all that. So thank you. My question is really just trying to see where you are, your thoughts regarding this. So when 9/11 happened, I had a lot of classmates because I went to a final year of high school here and then went into college. I had a lot of classmates and friends that were real Americans. Not that we're fake, but we're all immigrants, but real Americans, very adamant about why is this happening to us? You know, we help so many people in different countries and we do this and we do all this good, but yet these people, right? That's the word that was used. These people come and bomb us. And it afforded me an opportunity to sort of educate them. I'm like, do you know what pictures? Do you know what's happening in other countries? Do you know what Americans are doing to other countries? So you hit the nail on the head when you said we created a lot of these refugees and asylum seekers. So what are your thoughts and what would you recommend? Because I still hear that today, you know, given the society that we live in, the division, political division. What are your thoughts on how to address those questions? You know, I used to tell people travel. You have to leave this country to actually know what's going on around the world. So what are your thoughts on addressing those sort of questions and sort of putting people at ease that America is great, but it's not the be all and end all?
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with, I think people need to go to other places and see. It's like people who tell you how bad it would be if we had socialized medicine, like if we had universal health care, until they go someplace in Scandinavia and see how nice it is to have, or Canada, right? And see how nice it is not to fear getting sick or, you know. Now a friend of mine was telling me, when I see an ambulance, I pray, first of all, Lord, please let them have health insurance, you know, because that's how it is in our. So I think you hit the nail on the head on people really do need to be informed. They need to learn a little bit about our country and the way, you know, one of the things that happened when I started I read a lot of things about immigration. And I read a book called The Guarded Gates that was published not that long ago by a journalist. And it's about the history of that law that I told you about that was really heavily influenced by eugenics. And what I learned is that, I used to think, the epitome of evil in the movies is always like Nazis when it's an historical movie, right? It's always Nazis. They're like the worst thing ever. And I didn't know this, but a lot of what the Nazis did, they learned from America. For example, at the time that we had Jim Crow and segregation, they took notes on, oh, it works in America. Let's do the same thing. Let's do the same thing here to Jewish people. In fact, a lot of what was written here in the US about eugenics, we exported that to Germany, and they took it. And there were things that they even thought, the Nazis thought America took too far, believe it or not. Wow. They were not on board with like the whole 1 drop rule about if you had 1 drop of, black blood in you. So I was just really shocked by that because I had always learned that growing up, right? That this is like the epitome of evil is like the Nazis and the terrible things they did to Jewish people. I didn't know that the United States rejected hundreds upon hundreds of Jewish refugees, and that in fact, Anne Frank's family, her dad petitioned the United States for refugee status and he was rejected. And, his whole family died in the war. He's the only one who survived. And our country rejected him and didn't allow his family to enter. So there's just a lot that I think we have to learn about our own country. And there's a lot that I think we're not responsible. We didn't make the decision, but we do have to reckon with the injustices here in the present, right? And we have to deal with these things. So I think we have to be informed about the things that our country has done and continues to do, because we're going to continue to see the consequences of that played out in the world. So yeah, it's a really hard thing. When I used to be a high school teacher, and I remember we went to Europe. I took a group of students to Rome, and I remember the tour guide telling us, like, just say you're Canadians, and she gave us these little patches with the Canadian flag to put on our backpacks, because she was like, yeah, they don't really like Americans here because of the war in Iraq, and it's just really terrible. And she's like, it's not your fault. I just want you to be safe, and it was hard for the kids, I could tell, to really like recognize that, like, wait, but what have we done? Why do they not like us? And they don't know the reputation that the United States has around the world and the many things that have been done. And so it's hard. It's hard to reckon with the sins of a nation, but it's something we have to do as Americans. And that's
the unfortunate thing is that it doesn't seem like there are any plans of sort of remedying the situation. Some of these histories are being removed. I shudder to think when I look at what my children are being taught in school, like it's almost like a deliberate attempt to erase any part of history that makes them look terrible, for lack of a better term. And that worries me, because some of my children don't know much about the atrocities Americans have really committed. But you win some, you lose some. It's a bit disturbing to see and to hear and to experience it, especially with my children. So thank you.
Yeah, that's why I think it's important for us to be informed. There's certainly not a lack of resources in the world for us to learn these things. So
yeah, thank you. This was really great.
Karen, I know that we are running out of time. And I have a few questions, so I'm just going to choose one final one because I think it might be very hands-on, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So it says, as we welcome new immigrants and refugees in our local communities, are there things that you experienced that were helpful in terms of what people would do or people, or what they said? And also what things may have been harmful? So how do we best welcome and love our brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I think one of the best things that we can do is to recognize that it's true that when immigrants and refugees arrive in this country, they have needs, but they are also more than their needs. Immigrants bring their whole selves, right? They bring their gifts, their talents, their skills, and oftentimes I feel as immigrants, we're only recognized for our resilience, for how well we survived our traumas, but we're more than an immigrant person, and so I think being able to see people not as having, somehow it turns into seeing people as having less in every way, instead of just having moved to a new country and having less materially. That's true, right? Not having a lot, because when we resettle refugees, we help set up homes for them and all of that. So I think that there's a mutuality that's often lacking. I think there's a lack of being able to see people as whole human beings created in the image of God, who bring a whole lot more than needs. And I thought it was really beautiful. I don't know anything about her politics, but when Ilhan Omar came to Washington as a representative, she tweeted out something like, 24 years ago, we came to this country as refugees, and now I'm returning to DC, but this time to serve in the House of Representatives, And to me, that was so indicative of what most immigrants do. Yes, when we arrive, there are needs, but just as our God is a creator, we are creative, just as our God is good. We have good gifts and good things that we bring as well. So I think just seeing beyond the need is really, really important. And then being open to a mutual hospitality, to learning at each other's feet, not just one way. Because when hospitality only goes one way, there's something that's diminished in the other person. And I think it's okay for us to receive hospitality as well, and to learn. One of the things that I remember when we came to this country, for example, is that my parents, when we were sick, sent us to school anyway. Like, I remember being at school in the 4th grade and having a really bad cold, and the teacher got really upset. She said, "You shouldn't come to school when you're sick." But what she didn't know is that there was no one at home to take care of me. Like, my parents didn't have any options. There wasn't anyone who could just take a day off of work. They were undocumented. If they didn't work, they didn't have any sick days. They didn't have any vacation pay. And so I think also understanding that, yes, there may be things that immigrant families do that aren't standard American things, but also trying to be empathetic and look beyond the situation and giving the benefit of the doubt, because all parents love their children, regardless of culture or country, right? That's very universal. So are these parents just sending their kids to school to affect the rest of the school? Well, that's not very empathetic, right? That's not a very empathetic conclusion. But if you consider something like, you know what, they may not have childcare. Everybody in the family has to work. And so staying home means being home alone, and that's less safe than being in school with a cold, right? So I think also learning a little bit and being able to be supportive in those ways as well, to not assuming the worst about a family. I remember my house always smelled like black beans and plantains, because these are the foods of our country, and feeling kind of embarrassed about that, because American homes don't smell like this, and American people smell different, because in my culture, we love perfumes and lotions and all of these things, but it was like, no, in America, you don't wear that because it bothers other people, and Americans don't eat that many beans or plantains. And so America, depending on the food you eat, you smell different. And that's just a fact. And so being able to be, I guess, more empathetic and more compassionate of those kinds of differences without seeing them as somehow less than in some way. Because, yeah, especially the children, they'll absorb that, quickly, that there's something off or wrong, right, in this situation. So I think being supportive of families in that way, I think is a really good thing. And we experienced some really great interactions with Americans when we came to the US. Yeah, 5 bags of fried black beans. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I hope that was helpful. And I want to thank you all for this time. There's so many bad things happening in immigration. People often ask me, like, what's hopeful to you about it? And really gatherings like these are really hopeful to me when people want to learn and want to know more about how they can love their neighbors well, want to reckon with some of our terrible history and the ways that we can labor with God to make things right, in the future. And this to me is very hopeful. It's embodied hope that all of you are here tonight.
We are so incredibly thankful, Karen, that you joined us today, that you were able to share your wisdom. I think even for me as an immigrant, I learned from this. And these are very important conversations to have for all of us. And hopefully in our group for Be the Bridge, we continue to have these conversations, because I'm looking and there's a lot of immigrants in this group right now.
That's great. Yeah, that's
quite a few of us
wonderful.
here. But yeah, thank you very much, Amina. I don't know if you have any parting words.
I'll pass it over to my hubby.
Okay.
Well, I guess that's me. Yeah, Karen, this has been amazing in so many different ways. And I second 100% Ellen's comments. It's also the same, reading your book, The God Who Sees. Highly recommended. Wonderful list of recommendations and suggestions for things that we could do as individuals, things we could do as a group. I'll be excited, see what we as a group decide to do relative to the immigration issue. That's a major topic nationally and also locally. I think the one key thing that you left us with is this idea, and you mentioned it in your book, that even though the title of your book is The God Who Sees, that very often the question is whether we are able to see God embodied in his suffering, his struggles, and the poor who get shuffled around, etc. Whether we're able to see God in those individuals and respond to them from that point of view, that what we do too, and for God and for ourselves. And you make those points so wonderfully as you did here. I'm an immigrant too, so I join Ellen and everyone else here in just saying thank you for the work you've done. I hope that if we invite you back, especially after your next book, that you'll be able to come back to grace us again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, y'all.
Yeah, thank you,
All right.
Karen, so much. So thankful for you.